I review a lot of tools on this channel. And you get the tool, you use it for a few weeks, and you make the review. But then, sometimes months or even years later, you find out that the tool has some hidden weakness, or you find out you just don't like it. So, I bought 3 mid-priced hand planes and used them for a full year, so I would know everything about them. After a year, that review is pretty detailed. So let's skip straight to the results. All 3 of these planes are good tools at fair prices. This ECE Emmerich is my pick for best value. It's the cheapest out of the 3. This Kunz Plus plane is my best smoothing plane, and this Stanley Sweetheart No. 4 is my pick for best multi-purpose plane. Now, I just said a bunch of stuff, and you might find some of it confusing, but don't worry, we're going to explain everything. ECE Emmerich calls this a jack plane, but it's short and you can set it for a fine cut, so it makes a good smoothing plane for general bench work. And that's how I use it. This plane is made with a simple wedge and cross pin, which keeps costs down. It also has a metal strike button in the back, so you can do all the adjusting with a steel hammer. And setting a wooden plane is not difficult. Tap the iron to get the cut you want, and you can work all day. This plane might look old-fashioned, but it performs beautifully, ejects the shaving smoothly, and leaves an excellent surface. At $130, this tool offers great value. Need a heavier cut? No problem. Just give the iron a tap and, whoops, that's a little too heavy. And that's the problem. Wooden planes are pretty easy to set, but when you need to reset for a lighter cut, there's going to be some hunting around, tapping back and forth until you get back to that feathery smoothing cut. It's time-consuming, so most wooden plane users get the tool set up and then just leave it alone. In pre-industrial shops, the craftsman might have kept multiple smoothing-sized planes and set them up for different cuts. One plane could take a medium shaving to get rid of saw marks, and then a second plane could be set ultra-fine to deliver that final finish. Stanley's adjustable plane was a major innovation, not just because it was easy to set, but because it was easy to reset. This piece of oak is straight from the lumber yard, and it's rough. I'll start planing with no iron at all and advance the cutter until I'm taking the heaviest shaving that I can push. This lets me quickly take off all the surface roughness. Then I can spin the adjuster all the way back, start planing again, and advance the cutter until I'm taking the lightest possible shaving. A few quick passes over the board, and I'm done. I've just taken this wood from rough to finish ready with a single tool in less than a minute. That's the genius of adjustable metallic planes. This tool is actually 3 tools in one. It takes a medium cut, a superfine finishing cut, and because it's heavy and has square sides, you can also use it on the shooting board. This isn't the best shooting plane that I own, but here I am slicing through the end grain of oak, so it obviously works. Wooden coffin smoothers have curved soles, so they won't work on the shooting board, and short wooden planes are too light in general. You can't shoot with either of these. And if you're on a budget, you're probably looking for a tool that does more than one thing. This is where the Kunz Plus comes in. It's a surprisingly high-quality metal plane. It's got some thoughtful features, and it retails for just under $200. Now, that's not cheap, so what are you getting for your money? The Kunz is well machined, and all the parts have a nice finish. Everything fits together precisely. Inside, the plane has a movable frog, a lot like a Stanley. The adjuster is Norris style, so it controls both depth and lateral adjustment. This one is an updated design, and it works extremely well. The blade is a plain, high-carbon steel, which is just fine, and it has a well-designed chip breaker. The 2 pieces are easy to put together. The cap is kind of a pain. It has this hole underneath that has to fit over the chip breaker screw before you can tighten it down. But this design does lock everything together, and it makes adjustments easy. Out of the 3 planes, the Kunz has the best ergonomics by a long shot. The handles are comfortable and are shaped to encourage a good grip. That Norris-style adjuster is shorter and positioned lower than on other planes, so it gives you on-the-fly adjustments, just like you'd get with a vintage Stanley. Here I am dialing in a fine finishing cut without even taking the plane off the wood. That's a trick you can't even do with a real Norris. You really have to take your hand off the plane to change the setting. I mean, seriously, this knob is so high, I need a stepladder to reach it. Now, the Kunz plane is my favorite of these 3 planes by a long shot, but it's got two big shortcomings. The first thing is that most of the adjustment screws are hex head, which isn't a big deal. You can just use a hex key for them. And you adjust the mouth by moving this frog back and forth. But unfortunately, you really kind of need this special extra long hex key that they include with the plane. Now, I'd love to show you this tool, but I can't because clearly I lost that thing months ago. You're never going to keep track of a tiny little specialty tool in a busy shop. Now the good news is that you can adjust the mouth back and forth using a standard hex key. It's just a little bit clumsier and more fiddly. This plane, like most of mine, I got it and I set the mouth to the opening that I liked and I just left it alone. I don't plan on ever touching it again, so that's not a big problem. Another issue is the shape of the body. You see this sort of sharp portion right here? Well, when you put this on the shooting board and you put your hand against it, it's not just uncomfortable, it hurts. Shooting with a plane like this is impractical. So as much as I like it, you might be looking for a tool that does even more jobs at the bench. The Stanley Sweetheart No. 4 smoothing plane does more tricks than the other two planes, but it also has a lot of shortcomings. It's kind of a weird tool. On the surface, it looks a lot like the Kunz Plus, but the two are made very differently. The Stanley has a one-piece body where the frog is part of the casting. That's totally fine because it keeps costs down. The adjuster is a Norris style, but it's not as nice as the Kunz, and it's much more wobbly. Stanley uses this locking nut to keep the adjuster from moving side to side, but that's only necessary because the adjuster is positioned where your finger is guaranteed to knock into it. The Kunz, with its lighter, lower adjustment, doesn't need a lock because you're just not going to hit it by accident. The Stanley's iron is made of A2 steel, which will hold an edge longer than carbon steel, and it has a very nicely machined chip breaker. The lever cap is a lightweight piece of cast aluminum. It feels kind of cheap, but it works fine. The Stanley also has an adjustable toe plate. You twist the knob to loosen it, and then push this brass yoke back and forth. The mouth has a huge range of adjustment, and it's pretty easy to get any opening you want. Just like the Kunz, the Stanley will do a medium cut for leveling and a fine cut for getting that final surface. The adjuster is a little bit too high to be comfortable, but you can change the setting while you're planing, which makes things efficient. Out of the three planes, the Stanley is the only one that works on the shooting board. And it doesn't just work, it works really well. The body shape gives your hand a comfortable place to rest, and pushing the plane doesn't hurt. The tool is heavy, but that only helps when you're shooting. And that A2 blade is extra tough and won't be dulled as quickly by stubborn end grain fibers. Overall, this Stanley is like a lot of people I know. I respect it, but I don't like it very much. Now, it does all three things you could ask for: a medium cut, a fine finishing cut, and it shoots. It also has really robust construction. Everything is solid, and it's held up well over a year of heavy shop testing. However, the ergonomics on this plane are, well, they're lousy, honestly. The handle is uncomfortable, and it's too big. There's much too much weight in front of your hand, which makes it tough to hold. The plane is too heavy for general use. The handle is set too far back. The adjuster's kind of in a weird place. It has a lot of shortcomings. Honestly, this is a big, clunky tool intended for somebody who's never owned a hand plane before. Stanley released this smoother at the same time as their low-angle jack, which is an impressive value and doesn't have the shortcomings of the No. 4. If we look at the two planes together, you might notice all the parts they have in common, like the handles, the lever cap, and some of the adjusters. I think Stanley was really focused on putting out the low-angle jack, and then someone realized they could reuse a lot of parts and also come out with a small smoothing plane. That's a good approach because it keeps costs down, but it led to some compromises on the No. 4. Each of these planes has some shortcomings, but for what they cost, a lot of my viewers are going to expect out-of-the-box performance. Do any of these tools deliver? Kinda. The ECE Emmerich did not work at all when I first got it. The sole had to be flattened, but you expect that with a wooden plane. The back of the iron also needed flattening, and the chip breaker needed fitting. This was all quick stuff and took me less than an hour. The bigger problem was that I couldn't get the plane to hold its setting, even when I tapped the wedge in very tightly. The issue was this black plastic piece that bears on the wedge. It's too slick, so I roughed it up with some medium sandpaper. There's also a hard finish on the wedge, and I sanded that off both sides. These changes got the plane to hold its setting, and I've barely had to touch it since I first set it up. The Stanley actually did cut right out of the box without even honing the iron. I was pleasantly surprised. I've never had to flatten the iron or prepare the chip breaker. They were correct from the factory and they've held up beautifully. Unfortunately, the plane did start behaving kind of weirdly after I had it for a few weeks. After a while, I could only get this plane to take a super narrow shaving right in the middle of the blade, and that confused me for a long time until I thought to check the sole. And when I tested that, I found that the plane had developed this huge hollow all the way down the middle, and it was high on either edge. That meant that the iron was being held up off the wood, and it could only work right in the very center. This is not a big deal. All you have to do is color in the bottom of the plane with a marker and then just lap it flat with sandpaper. The problem is that I know the sole was dead flat when I got the tool. It moved later. Cast iron tends to flex and shift for several months after it comes from the foundry. There are a lot of stresses inside the material, and those forces are slowly released over time. Back when Stanley made planes in America, they used to let their plane bodies sit for a full year before machining, and I suspect that they just didn't let these castings rest long enough before they finished the plane. So after I had it for a while, it moved, and I had to flatten it. The good news is that I only had to do it once. I flattened the plane again for this video, and you can see that it's got a little bit of a low spot toward the heel, but nothing serious. The plane was working just fine, and after reflattening it, it's still working really well. This Kunz had kind of the same problem, except that it actually bowed like a piece of wood. So it was very high at the toe and heel and very hollow in the middle, right where the iron is. This has a big impact on performance and really keeps the tool from working well. Now, I like this one a lot, so I want to say that I only had to flatten it once. But when I went to make this video, I grabbed this plane after not using it for a couple of months, and it was behaving weirdly again. So I took it back to the lapping setup, and after only a few strokes on the sandpaper, you can see big high spots at the toe and heel and a massive hollow around the mouth. The tool cannot work like this, and having to fix it twice is annoying. These castings must have had a lot of internal stress when I took the tool out of the box. For around $200, I was hoping for more. So a full year of testing has revealed the good and the bad for each of these planes, and you're probably wondering which one you should buy. The ECE Emmerich is a high-quality tool, and at about $130, it's an excellent value. But it's not super versatile. You're probably going to set this plane up to take your final finishing cut, and that's about it. So if you want to buy this plane, I also recommend you purchase some sort of a jack plane, like this long metallic one here. This has the length you need for straightening and leveling surfaces, and you can use it on the shooting board. You're also going to need a scrub plane, or something similar to do a lot of your rough, heavy stock removal. And honestly, eventually, everybody probably wants a jointer plane. So the ECE is a great choice, but only if you're going to invest in a complete set of bench planes. The Stanley is not a refined tool, but it is durable and well made, and it handles all three of the tasks we might want a good smoothing plane to do. If I were going to go with the Stanley, I would pair it with an inexpensive vintage 4-plane, like this one. It's a lot like a scrub. It's got a cambered iron and a wide mouth, and it does heavy stock removal. But it's also long, so it tends to level and straighten things while you're working. You can do your rough stock prep with something like this, and then move on to the Stanley to do pretty much all the rest of the cuts. Now, I wouldn't recommend using this 2-hand plane setup for your entire woodworking career, but if you're getting started on a budget, you can do a lot of projects with these 2 planes. Even though I had to flatten it twice, the Kunz Plus is still my favorite by a long shot. It's precise, comfortable, easy to use, and very easy to switch back and forth between a fine and a medium cut. Now, if you want a tool like this, it's not going to handle shooting or every task for a plane, so I still recommend you pick up a jack plane like this vintage metallic jack, and you're going to need a plane for heavy stock removal, like any cheap old plane set up as a scrub. And eventually you're going to want a jointer plane. Now, you might notice this is the exact same setup I recommended if you buy the wooden ECE Emmerich plane, and you might be wondering, why would I spend more money on the Kunz when I still have to buy all these other planes? Well, it's because the Kunz is just a better tool. It's easier to use, it's much easier to adjust, and it's just very tight and beautifully machined. If you buy the wooden Emmerich plane, it'll work great for a long time, but eventually you're probably going to want to trade it in for something better. If you buy this plane and tune it up so it's really working, you might never want another smoothing plane. And that's why I like it so much. So, I've got a reputation as being the cheap tool guy, and I am okay with that. I'm the guy who will show you how to find the most inexpensive tools and get going with your woodwork. But I've been doing this for a while now, and I'm about to say something very obvious. Cheap tools are cheap. They might work well, they might work really well, but there's going to be shortcomings. They might be hard to adjust, difficult to push. They might be uncomfortable and put a lot of strain on your hands. Eventually, cheap tools aren't going to get the job done anymore. If you're serious about your woodwork, at some point, you're going to have to invest. And that's why I made this video, because I know a lot of my viewers need to step up to nicer, more comfortable tools. And I should point out that a video like this would be financially stupid if I didn't have patrons. I bought all 3 of these hand planes a year ago. I threw down $400 or $500, and I have no idea if this video is going to make enough money to cover the cost of these tools. But because I have patrons, I don't have to worry about that. They give me the financial support that lets me take a risk on something like this. Even if this video doesn't recoup the cost of the tools, I'll still be okay, and everybody still gets an unbiased tool review, because I paid for these tools and it's not being sponsored. My patrons make all of this possible. If you'd like to be one of them, go on over to patreon.com/RexKruger and check out the rewards and early access I have for the people who make these videos possible. I will see everybody back here next week for another video. Thanks so much for watching.